Hey everybody, welcome to the next lecture in the Congress class. I'm sitting here in front of Congress, in fact. Really, of course, I'm sitting in my office on a Zoom recording, and you are seeing an image of Congress behind me. And the reason I have this particular image is just because it is evocative of what Congress can look like when it's in session. And what I'm talking about in this lecture is the evolution of procedures in the House and the Senate. And the procedures govern the kind of thing that you see behind me, as well as, and really, I would say more importantly, the behavior and activities that occur in meetings and hearing rooms. But of course, the floor of each House of Congress is where the final big important stuff happens, the debate, the amendments, and the final voting, yay or nay, on passage of a bill. The basic procedural outline of each House of Congress is roughly the same. Bills are introduced, they are sent to committee. Committees do a lot of work on those bills. They're either killed in committee or they're voted out of committee and they're sent to the full chamber, sometimes called the committee of the whole, which is what you see behind me. And they're voted on there and either passed and sent on to the other house, the chamber, or if the other chamber has already passed it and this version is passed in the exact same version, sent on to the president either for signature or for veto. That's the basic outline of procedure. But of course, as I noted in the last lecture, Section 5 of Article 1 of the Constitution gives each House control over the rules of its proceedings. And of course, the cliche, the devil is in the details, that absolutely has to do with the way a chamber of Congress deals with that basic outline or moves through that basic outline of the congressional or of the legislative process. How do things get sent to committee? Do they get sent to a single committee or multiple committees? Who is on the committees? What is the makeup of them? Who chairs that? What are the rules of procedure within the committees? What does it look like when a bill is reported out of committee to the full chamber? How can debate proceed or be stopped? What kind of amendments can be offered? What can't? When can members be compelled to attend? When does debate have to end and voting take place? What kinds of votes, either roll call or voice acclamation? What sorts of objections? All of these questions are addressed by a voluminous body of parliamentary procedure. And there's a basic parliamentary guideline, and Robert's Rules is a book that sort of outlines the basic parliamentary rules in general. But because each chamber of Congress has the right to set its own rules of proceedings, each has altered the basic parliamentary procedure with specific features that will determine how things move through this broad legislative process. I'm not going to go through the details of congressional parliamentary procedure because there are too many. They're often very detailed, very arcane, and I will be honest, I'm not a parliamentary expert. I don't really understand or know all of these rules. So I'm going to talk about things in general. I also am not going to go through it all because two of your readings are on important reforms to congressional procedure, and so you'll get a more detailed sense of what kinds of new regulations Congress has put into effect in the last 50 years to determine what kinds of procedures are used as it moves through the broad basic legislative process. I do want to just do some general kind of notes and indications about things to do with this process. One, of course, is the organization of committees. The two-step process of having committees work on bills and then having the entire chamber debate, amend, and vote has been around since before Congress even existed. This approach was used in the Constitutional Convention by the delegates who knew that they had a lot of work to do, and they divided up that labor among committees that were selected from among their members, and those committees did their work and made their choices and reported those choices out to the entire convention, which then voted to either accept them or reject them or amend them. And that's how we got the US Constitution. So the basic two-step process of a smaller body, a committee, doing a lot of the work, and then followed by the committee of the whole or the entire body doing the final deciding on the outcome, predates Congress itself. What is a constant source of change, and I don't mean constant as in daily or monthly or even yearly, but across generations and across decades, a constant process of change is what is the nature of those committees, what's their jurisdiction, how are the chairs of those committees chosen, what are the powers of the chair, what are the powers of the members of the committee, what kinds of supermajorities are needed to override normal procedure and put into place extraordinary procedures. Those rules have been in effect and transformed since the beginning of Congress. The very first Congress, they had a lot to do. They had to organize the executive branch, they had to set up the Supreme Court and the rest of the judicial system. They also had to organize themselves, establish committees, figure out what the rules were going to be, and then follow those rules to actually enact legislation. Every Congress has, every session of Congress, every 2 years, has the right to change those rules. In fact, it has the responsibility to create a new set of rules, which are, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, often just adopted from the previous session of Congress. And within any session of Congress, those rules can be changed, but typically the changes occur at the beginning. Several important changes have taken place over the last 50 years. One is the selection of committee chairs and the imposition of term limits on committee chairs. One of the reasons why that's so important is because under the old system, the system that existed up until the middle of the 20th century and well into the 1970s, chairs of committees had extraordinary amounts of power over legislative outcomes. The committees themselves were the center of gravity of the legislative process. They weren't just a kind of working group that did all the grunt work and then passed on the final, more important and more powerful step to the committee as a whole. The committees themselves were essentially the legislative process, and by the time something got to the chamber as a whole, it was largely a foregone conclusion that it was either going to be voted up or down and not amended very much. And that wasn't the expectation, that a bill would get worked on a lot in the committee as a whole. This became problematic for a number of reasons, one of which is that committees could turn into these kind of little fiefdoms of the committee chairs. How you get to be the chair, if it's based on seniority and majority party, you could be the senior member of the majority party and just camp out in a committee for sometimes a decade or more and essentially have almost total control over that particular area of policy. Let's say you're the long-standing serving chair of the Agriculture Committee. No agricultural policy changes get made except going through you and you specifically only. And while there have always been supermajority procedures that allowed members of the committee to override the power of the chair, much like any supermajority requirement in a parliamentary procedure, it's used very infrequently and is not typically a functional form of any kind of check. And so for a really long time, committee chairs had relatively unchecked power. And so one of the earliest reform waves in modern times, not early in congressional history, but early as in about 50 years ago, was to essentially reduce that power by getting rid of the seniority requirement, by changing the way committee chairs were appointed. And the effect of this was to move the center of power away from committee chairs and onto the party leadership in each chamber, who had almost unchecked power to assign committees and assign committee chairs and to assign bills to specific committees. And so party leadership became a more important feature, a more important power center in the legislative process. The same two-step legislative process. Bills still go through committees. Committees still have these same kinds of, they still do the same kind of work. They investigate, they mark up, they amend, they debate, they hear from experts and stakeholders. They still do the bulk of the work, but it's more of a working group now and less of a power center like it was for the most of the history of Congress. This is potentially going to be transformed again, because one of the things that's happened in the last decade or two is that the kinds of bills that the party leadership wants to bring to the floor aren't necessarily garnering even the support of the majority party. There are fissures within the majority party. Both Democrats and Republicans have faced this in the 21st century. And it's very difficult when the party leadership is the power center to advance anything other than pretty partisan legislation. It's in committees that deals get made. It's in committees that bipartisanship actually flourishes most functionally. And so the movement away from committees, and there are a variety of other reasons why partisanship and partisan polarization have increased in Congress, but the movement of the center of power from committees to the party leadership is definitely one of those important factors. To combat that, the sort of dysfunction that has been created by this polarization, I see a movement coming to begin moving more authority and more power and more activity back into committees to allow these kinds of this kind of close at hand deal making and negotiating and pragmatic compromising to take place, which doesn't typically take place when the whole body is voting. We get more and more party line votes in the committee of the whole. One of the other things, and this I think is an important transformation in the legislative process that has contributed to the dysfunction of Congress recently, is rules about what kinds of things can be put into bills. Congress, for decades and decades, for most of its history, had a thing called earmarks, which would allow targeted spending to states and districts in appropriations bills and even in other regular kinds of bills that would create opportunities for winning over members of Congress by essentially giving their district a bonus. And while that can sound corrupt and problematic, and it means that certain legislators are able to bring home a lot of goodies for their district and others are not able to, what earmarks created was an opportunity for that sort of deal making that created a bipartisan legislation coming out of committees. The earmarks sound bad, and they were banned a little over a decade ago because Congress was worried that public opinion had turned against the practice of earmarks, and it looked unclean and it looked like corrupt politics. There is pressure to return earmarks to the congressional process by changing parliamentary rules that enable these kinds of riders to be put into bills, to recreate the conditions that would allow for this kind of bipartisan deal making, and to move again the power center away from the increasingly partisan party leadership and back into the smaller working groups of committees, where, while there will still be this fiefdom-like aspect to the committee chair, in a smaller group, closer hand, with the ability to cut deals and to then pass on to the floor of the entire chamber, something that involves input from both Democrats and Republicans. Earmarks are seen as a potentially important part of transforming a currently dysfunctional legislative process back into something that is more effective and more efficient. So this is one example of how parliamentary rules can actually have a significant impact on the productivity, the effectiveness, the bipartisanship that occurs in Congress. We have a lack of bipartisanship. We have polarization, partly because of political polarization in our broader political culture, partly because of the way that the two parties have evolved and their electorates respond to members of Congress who do or don't follow their very specific ideological desires for them. But it is also a result of transformations in parliamentary procedure and congressional organization that have made it more difficult for legislators from different parties to work together, that have made it more difficult to create deals and to compromise and to get things through Congress that don't just have a straightforward party line vote. And there have been numerous waves, as the readings for this module demonstrate, that have transformed how these kinds of deals and negotiations and procedures work. And these kinds of reform movements come because of public pressure. Typically, members of Congress themselves aren't going to want to change a system that they're already familiar with, that they've learned how to operate within, that they have adapted to, and have created relationships and procedures around these familiar parliamentary procedures. They will, however, engage in reform movements when the pressure from the public is strong enough that to not act is worse than to act, and to change familiar old ways into something that is perhaps unfamiliar and potentially a little scary, but that responds to the public's demands for something new. This happens sometimes when there are ethics problems, when there are scandals, when it seems like the members of Congress are out of touch with the members of their constituencies. It also happens, and it's happening right now, when there's pressure from the public for Congress to be less dysfunctional, to be less obstacle-ridden, less able to get anything through. And we are definitely living in a time where Congress appears to be broken to a lot of Americans. And so reform efforts are mounting. And those reform efforts will, in a lot of ways, center around these kinds of parliamentary procedures. Now, that brings up, of course, the big one, which is the Senate filibuster. And I'm going to just wrap up this lecture by talking relatively briefly about the filibuster. And to note that, of course, here in the spring of 2021, that we're in the middle of a very vigorous debate as to whether or not the filibuster needs to be preserved to preserve the Senate, or whether it's actually breaking the Senate, whether getting rid of the filibuster will break the Senate, or whether it will save democracy. There's a very vigorous debate going on right now over this particular issue. And if the filibuster is either changed or eliminated entirely, that will have a profound and transformative effect on the legislative process. Proponents of it, of course, are arguing that the profound change will be a beneficial one. Opponents of it, of course, arguing that the profound change will be a problematic and negative one. And that is always going to be the debate when rules of procedure are considered by Congress, that the changes are either better, healthier, more effective, are going to make Congress better, healthier, more effective, or the changes are going to make Congress worse, less democratic, more broken, more partisan, whatever the critiques happen to be. I have posted an optional reading on the history of the House filibuster. The House of Representatives had the filibuster actually first, and it wasn't called the filibuster, it was called the silent quorum, and you can read about it in this article. I highly recommend it. It's relatively short. It's only 1,600 words, so not too terribly long of a read and very fascinating. But the House got rid of the filibuster in the late 19th century, and amid a very vigorous and controversial debate about whether this change was going to rescue the House of Representatives or was going to break the House of Representatives. A very similar and possibly even more controversial debate occurred at the time than is going on right now over the Senate filibuster. The main driving force behind making these kinds of big rule changes, getting rid of the filibuster, is public pressure and the goals and opportunities of members of Congress themselves. If the Democrats in the Senate, backed by the President of the United States, also a Democrat, decides to get rid of the legislative filibuster, that will be because of pressure from their constituents to actually move on the Democratic agenda, despite the fact that Republicans can stop it with the filibuster, to get rid of that obstacle. And it will come from a sense that this is an opportunity and or a necessity for, one, winning re-elections in the future, two, retaining the support of their donors and their activists who provide energy for them, and three, whether or not actually succeeding at implementing the agenda as they have it now is going to be beneficial for themselves as legislators and politicians and for the party as a whole going into the future. There is a political calculation around all of this. It's not a question of is it right or wrong, because there really is no answer to is it right or wrong. And there's no answer to is it in alignment with our founding values or our founding principles or not, because there's a debate, there are arguments on both sides. The filibuster is and is not right. It is and is not wrong. It has anti-democratic features for sure, but democracy itself has a built-in value of separation of powers and checks and balances, and so it has a legitimate claim to having a democratic pedigree. The argument may rhetorically take place about such concepts as democracy and majority rule, and effectiveness and efficiency and responsiveness and all of those different high-level values and criteria. But the changes will take place because of political forces and because of political pressures, both within the party as well as from the public. And that has always been the case. The waves of reform that have swept through Congress at various points. The 70s was a post-Watergate wave of reform. 1994, the Contract with America was another big wave of reform. Were a result of essentially politicians seeing an opportunity to either win more support or strengthen the support that they already had. The Contract with America in 1994 was the Republican Party's congressional platform. And there were some policy aspects to it, like welfare reform and criminal justice reform, but the bulk of the Contract with America provisions were about congressional reform, both ethics, strengthening ethics rules, as well as transforming procedures to make, in the view of the authors of the Contract with America, to make Congress more responsive to the popular will. The reason why Republicans cooked up the Contract with America, ran so hard on it, was because they saw it as an opportunity to win more voters and to take control of Congress, and they were right. They did both of those things. Interestingly, many of the new ethics rules captured some Republican leaders in scandals and ended up having them have to resign in shame based on the rules, breaking the rules that they themselves had brought into place or put in place because of their promise in the Contract with America. So sometimes when you make a change to the current system, the new system traps you in its jaws, which is one of the things that happened to people like Tom DeLay in the mid-90s after the Republican Revolution of 1994. And one of the lessons of this, and politicians know these lessons sort of implicitly, is that when you change the game that you're already familiar with and that you're already relatively successful in, it's dangerous and risky. And you're only going to change it with the hope that you're going to create a new game, a new system that you and people like you and people who agree with you, people who are in your same party, are going to succeed and prosper inside of. So that's the driving force behind the evolution of procedures in Congress. It's not a perfecting of the parliamentary methods. It's not an increasing effectiveness and efficiency and responsiveness. It's not making it more democratic. All of these will be rhetorical arguments in favor of certain kinds of changes. But underlying all of this, because the people who have to abide by these rules are the ones setting the rules themselves, as Section 5 of Article 1 says, each house shall set its own rules of proceeding, that you as a member of Congress get to decide the rules of the game that you are playing. And when you have that power, you're going to exercise that power in ways that will increase your political opportunities, decrease the obstacles that you face. You'll be doing it for primarily political reasons. And so that is actually one of the underlying sort of fermentation vats of transformation in Congress are the pressure from party leaders, pressure from the public, pressure from the activist base of each party, and elected officials themselves responding to these various pressures by pushing for certain kinds of transformations in procedures. As I say, the filibuster, by the time you're watching this issue may have actually been resolved in the Senate already, but it's just one example of many. I do see coming some set of reforms to procedure that will potentially reinstate earmarks or recreate some kind of conditions that will allow there to be more compromise, more deal making, and that will probably have the effect of moving the center of gravity from party leaders back towards committees. Now, in module 2 of the course, where I focus on the specific features of the legislative process, we're going to drill down a little bit more into what committees and party leaders do and how it is that they exercise their power and what the impact has been of this shift in the center of gravity from committee chairs to party leaders in each chamber. So you will hear more about this going forward. Until now, I'm wishing you goodbye from the U.S. Capitol building.